Good evening. How beautiful was that? That was Cantor Ozzie Schwartz singing Psalm 150, Hallelujah, to the tune of Leonard Cohen's beautiful and haunting melody, Hallelujah. Nina and I were privileged to know Leonard, and it was a huge loss to the world, I think, in 2016. I'm so glad that we knew him, that we were able to see him perform live over there at the Nokia Center, just not so long before he left this world. What an incredible, incredible talent, songwriter, performer. How are you? How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be with you on a Sunday night, learning a little Talmud together. Let's light up the darkness. Who's going to be with us as we get it going on a Sunday night? Stephen in Dover, New Hampshire. Melissa in Great Neck, New York. Gail in Virginia. Vaughn in Fremont, Ohio. Sandy in Michigan. Renee in Indy. Hannah in Mississippi. Allison in North Carolina. Kathleen in upstate New York in West Sand Lake. John in Sedona, Janice in Texas, Nancy in North Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Delana says I'm on time for once. Welcome, Delana. Great to have you with us live. Suzanne in Nashville, and Delana's in Lockhart, Texas. Sueli Sue says boa noite. Is that perhaps in Portuguese? Are you in Brazil? Let us know. Kathy says shalom. Over there on the YouTube side, Sheila's in Montana, and Neil is in Virginia. Also, Lisa Beth in Chicago. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is dedicated by Faith Phillips and the Phillips family in honor of Michael Floyd. May you all be blessed with tremendous, tremendous brachas in your life. Thanks to the merit of our learning together, added to your merit and Michael Floyd's merit, both in this world and the next. And we say Amen. All right, where are we holding? This is Daf Chaf Test, page 29 in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We're studying the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 2 and studying the second Mishna of chapter 2. Our Mishnah teaches that chametz, leaven, which is prohibited to a Jew during Passover. What about chametz after Passover? That's what we're talking about. So if you did things properly and you sold whatever chametz you didn't want to destroy, dispose of through burning or crumbling and scattering in the wind or in the ocean, so you sell it to a non-Jew with whom you have a good relationship, or perhaps your rabbi has a good relationship, and he's selling all the congregants' chametz to a non-Jew. It's a symbolic sale, really. You sell it before Passover, and then you buy it back after Passover. Therefore, it is not in your possession during Passover. And here our Mishnah specifically teaches that chametz owned by a Gentile, by a non-Jew, during Passover. After Passover, when chametz is permitted to us, that chametz will be permitted to us as well. Why is that important? Because chametz that's owned by a Jew during Passover, which would violate a prohibition. The prohibition, as it says in the Torah, it shall not be seen with you. It shall not be seen in your possession. So if a Jew owns chametz, even if he doesn't eat it during Passover, but he owns it during Passover, then that chametz, after its time has passed, meaning after Passover has passed, is going to remain prohibited for Jews to eat or even benefit from after Passover. That's the Mishnah that we're studying now. And now we continue the Gemara's discussion of that Mishnah. Now, Rava says that this Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who holds that a Jew's chametz during Passover actually is permitted to another Jew for benefit after Passover by Torah law, but agrees that it is prohibited for another Jew to benefit from that chametz that was owned by a Jew during Passover. It's going to be prohibited to a Jew to benefit from after Passover, another Jew, by rabbinic decree, right? It would be according to Rabbi Shimon, it's permitted by Torah law, but the rabbi still issued a decree on it to put that fence around the Torah, and it should not have been in a Jew's possession, and the penalty that a Jew possessed that chametz, that leaven, during Passover is that no Jew can benefit from it even after Passover. Rabbi Yehuda holds the same, no Jew can benefit from it after Passover, but he says that is by a Torah law, not just rabbinic decree. Even by Torah law, a Jew cannot benefit from chametz that was owned by a Jew during Passover. And this decree was issued because the Jew who owned chametz during Passover violated the Torah prohibition, "It shall not be seen with you." That's Exodus 13:7. Okay, now we ask a new question. What if someone had in his possession chametz, leavened products, that before Passover had been consecrated, had been set aside to donate to the temple, or set aside to donate to the priests? Perhaps it was teruma, perhaps it was even kodesh, meaning that teruma means that it was part of the tithe set aside for the priests. You're going to give it to a priest, and only a priest can eat it. Kodesh means it was set aside to accompany an offering that was going to be offered on the altar in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem when the temple was standing. It's been gone for 2,000 years, but we study these laws as if the temple were standing. So this chametz that was consecrated, now once it's consecrated, you may be holding on to it because you haven't given it to a priest or given it to the temple yet, but you don't actually own it. It's owned by God, as it were. It's owned either by the priests or by the temple for the sake of the offerings. And as we've seen before, that's a very strict law, that something which is consecrated cannot be used by a non-priest or some other use than the temple if you misappropriate things that have been set aside for holy purposes to your own purposes. If you did that on purpose, so then you become liable to excision, right? Charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court, which usually means that you would lose some years of your life or some amount of time from your lifespan. And we're not given to know how much or how it's going to be how that justice is going to be meted out by heaven. But the Torah says that soul shall be cut off from its people. If you misappropriated consecrated items unwittingly, not on purpose, so then you have a procedure for atonement and for a cure, right? So then you become like violating Shabbos. If you do that unwittingly, then you become liable to bring a sin offering, a chatas, a certain kind of offering to the temple that's going to be offered on the altar. And you have to pay back the priest or the temple what you misappropriated, plus a fine, a penalty stipulated by the Torah of 1/5. In other words, 20% on top of what you misappropriated. So what if someone had in his possession chametz that was consecrated to the temple, and he ate that during Passover unwittingly, right? He did this unwittingly. Now, does he become liable to bring the sin offering and pay the temple back the value of what he ate plus 20%? One approach to this question is, When he ate the chametz, he at that point actually receives charis, right? So a Jew that eats chametz during Passover, he is liable to charis. That's why we're so careful to remove all chametz from our possession, because somebody that eats leavened bread, leavened products, a Jew who eats leavened bread, leavened products during Passover is subject to charis, excision, an earlier death than otherwise at the hands of the heavenly court. So since he becomes liable to this heavy punishment, that soul is cut off from his people, there's a principle among the sages that when you're liable to two punishments for the same action, you actually only receive the stiffer penalty, right? As opposed to American law, when you do this, when the same crime results in two penalties, maybe two sentences, it's two, the same action causes you to be guilty of two different crimes. So you might have, concurrent or even subsequent sentences, years added to your jail time. But according to the sages, if you become liable to two penalties for these two crimes that you committed with one action, you're only going to receive the stiffer penalty. So in this case, death at the hands of the heavenly court is a stiffer penalty than paying back the temple the value of, this consecrated bread that you probably ate just a little bit, plus 20%. So you don't actually have to bring the sin offering or pay back the temple with the penalty, because the stiffer penalty is the one that applies. Another approach to this question of the Jew who ate consecrated chametz during Passover is that the chametz that he ate during Passover, he's definitely liable for charis, but in terms of me'ila, the misappropriation of consecrated food, it doesn't apply, right? Because when you misappropriate something that belongs to the temple, well, included in the elements of that crime, as it were, is that you consumed something that belongs to the temple. In other words, you consumed something. In other words, something of value. If chametz is prohibited to all Jews during Passover, one can say that chametz has no value during the festival of Passover. And so even this consecrated chametz that you ate, what you ate had no value. So you're liable to charis, to excision, but you're not liable for misappropriating something belonging to the temple, because there's no thing there. There's nothing there. It has no value since it is chametz during the week of Passover. Another approach to this question is that although Pesach will have passed over this chametz, according to some opinions, in other words, you ate this chametz during Passover, when you might think it has no value, but at least according to some opinions, this chametz over which Passover passed, right? After Passover, it's going to be permitted again to a Jew. So therefore, it has value. It doesn't have value during Passover, but there's some kind of future value there. And so that would kind of reinstate this possibility that you ate something that belongs to the temple. It does have value since it will have value after Passover, and then therefore you might be liable to bring that sin offering and to owe the temple the value of what you ate plus 20%. That would bring back the question of, okay, but if you have liable to charis and to me'ila, excision and misappropriating something that was holy, are you going to be liable to pay both penalties? Since we have the principle that generally speaking, we only are liable to the stiffer penalty. Does that apply here? We're not sure. We're not answering that question right now. New issue. Rav says, let's say that chametz becomes mixed with permitted food, right? So if the chametz is being mixed with permitted food, obviously Rav is implying that the chametz is prohibited. Why is it prohibited? It's prohibited because it's during Passover, or This is chametz that was owned, let's say, by a Jew during Passover, and according at least to Rabbi Yehuda, even by Torah law, after Passover, it will still be prohibited. So the question is, what about this prohibited chametz? What if it gets mixed with permitted foods? Are the permitted foods now going to become prohibited? Now, this is a very interesting area of the Talmud. We're going to be talking about it many times. We've talked a little bit already about the prohibited mixture of milk and meat, right? Kosher meat and kosher dairy, both things are permitted to a Jew to eat. If the milk and meat become mixed, then it becomes prohibited, right? And we saw that the Torah says it's prohibited to cook meat in milk. And the sages learned out that it is also prohibited for benefit, right? You can't even benefit from it. You can't be in the business of making cheeseburgers, on top of the fact that you can't eat a cheeseburger. Okay. But what if you have, let's say a beef stew and just like a little tiny piece of cheese fell into it, or you had a fondue and just a tiny little piece of meat fell into it? Does that render the whole thing, this mixture, prohibited? Now we're going to be talking about that in the context of just a little bit of prohibited chametz is going to fall into some other food that would otherwise be permitted. And the question is the whole pot going to become prohibited? That's the question. So Rav says, if this happens, and now we're going to have three approaches to this question. One is going to be from Rav, one is going to be from Shmuel, and one is going to be from Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have different approaches to this question. So the chametz falls into permitted food. If it happens during Passover, says Rav, whether the chametz is mixed with its own kind or a different kind. Meaning, what is the chametz? It's some kind of leaven grain product, right? So let's just say that it's some kind of flour from beef, it's flour. Okay, so flour, even though it didn't have yeast mixed into it, regular flour is not permitted during Passover. When we bake during Passover, what do we use? We use matzah meal, right? So it's this flour basically made out of crumbled matzah that is guaranteed not to behave like a regular flour. Okay, but it still is, it's still like a fine, floury type of substance that comes from wheat. So if we mix chametz with its own kind or not with its kind, meaning we have some kind of chametz and it falls into something totally different. Let's just say some kind of a soup that is not depending on grain at all, like into a potato soup. So the potato soup, definitely permitted during Passover. But says Rav, if chametz falls into either something that is like a grain, that is a grain product, or not a grain product, whether it falls into its own kind or not its own kind, chametz is such a stringently prohibited substance during Passover that as soon as some chametz falls into other kinds of, into food, whatever that food is going to be prohibited. It's a strict liability, says Rav, whether it's mixed with its own kind, like matzah meal or some other kind of food, prohibited. If after Passover, right, so now we're talking about chametz that's prohibited because let's say it was owned by a Jew during Passover, but now it's after Passover. At that point, if it's mixed with its own kind, according to Rav, it's prohibited, just as it was during Passover. But if it's mixed not with its own kind, some other kind of food, let's say potato soup, in that case, it's going to be permitted so long as this prohibited food does not impart its own flavor onto the larger pot that it's getting mixed into. And the sages have elsewhere decreed that, of course, there's some foods impart more flavor than others, but as a general rule, when a prohibited food falls into a permitted food, as long as the prohibited food is less than 1/60th, 1 part in 60 of the larger pot of permitted food. It's going to be nullified by the permitted food, and the mixture is therefore going to be permitted. If it's more than 1 part in 60, like if it's 1/30th of the whole, then it's going to be prohibited. Now, if it actually imparts flavor, if the prohibited substance imparts flavor, then even if it's a smaller percentage, it's still going to render the whole prohibited. It needs to be nullified in the whole in order to keep the whole thing permitted. Right? So you might ask, well, if the question has to do with imparting flavor, but this mixture might be prohibited to a Jew, how is he supposed to know without possibly transgressing the law by tasting it? And the answer is, if you have a non-Jewish friend who's around and can taste it for you and can tell you, well, this little tiny thing that you added to this big mixture, it was like a really strong spice, so actually it did change the flavor of the whole, then that would be one way to ascertain. But if you don't have a non-Jewish friend who can make that taste test for you, then you rely on this fraction, right? That as long as it's less than 1/60th, it's nullified in the mixture and the mixture remains permitted. But if it's more, if it becomes more than 1/60th, then it's going to be prohibited. And Rav is consistent with his own reasoning because we learned that both Rav and Shmuel often disagree with each other. They're kind of like argumentation partners. But Rav and Shmuel both say that that the general rule with regard to prohibited foods is that when they fall into their own kind, it's going to render the mixture prohibited. But if it falls into something not of its kind, it's going to be permitted as long as it doesn't impart its flavor on the mixture, basically meaning as long as it's 1/60th or less with the mixture. And it makes sense that this general principle that prohibited foods, when they fall into their own kind, it's going to be prohibited. Why are they saying that? Because since it's its own kind of food, and part of it is prohibited because of some legal reason, like it was set aside to be given to a priest, for example, it's teruma, and that's why it's not permitted for a regular Jew to eat it. But what it falls into is the same kind of food. All right, so there's no way that you could say, does it impart its flavor onto the mixture? The mixture is the same kind of food. It's just that the prohibited part is prohibited because it had been set aside as a tithe for the priest, and that therefore it should not have been eaten by a Jew. But we can't do a taste test to ask, did the teruma portion of this mixture impart its flavor to the whole? Then you have to rely on, was it 1/60th or not? But according to Rav and Shmuel, it doesn't even matter whether it's 1/60th or not. When something that's prohibited falls into a mixture of its own kind, the mixture is going to be prohibited. And Rav added an extra decree for Passover, right? Because Rav said that during Passover, whether it mixed in with its own kind or a different kind, it's going to render the mixture prohibited. So why didn't Rav say, well, during Passover, if this chametz falls in with something, but it's a very small amount and it doesn't impart its flavor onto this mixture, which is a different kind of food than the chametz that fell into it, why isn't that permitted? And Rav issued a decree that during Passover, chametz is so prohibited that he decreed against a mixture of chametz in some other kind of food, because if he permitted that, people might come to violate the prohibition on chametz in its own kind of food. And as for mixing with its own type after Pesach, after Passover, Rav prohibits because he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, that chametz that was owned by a Jew during Passover remains prohibited after Passover. But after Passover, he does permit that kind of prohibited chametz, because it was owned by a Jew, if it's mixed with a different kind of food, is going to be permitted as long as it doesn't impart its flavor, is less than 1/60th of the whole, because at that point, he's not concerned that a person will come to mix that kind of prohibited chametz with its own kind. He's not issuing a decree upon a decree. Second approach to this question of what if prohibited chametz gets mixed with permitted foods. The second approach is according to Shmuel, right? So Shmuel and Rav were colleagues. They lived at the same time. They were debating partners. Now let's see how Shmuel approaches this question. So during Passover, if this chametz is always prohibited during Passover. So if it gets mixed with its own kind, that mixture is prohibited no matter what the proportions are. If during Passover, this prohibited chametz is mixed with food of a different kind, right? So a little bit of leaven fell into the potato soup. As long as the leaven product is less than 1/60th of the potato soup mixture and doesn't impart its flavor onto the soup mixture, Shmuel would permit that. If it mixed with permitted food after Passover, and why was this chametz be prohibited after Passover? As we said, because it was owned by a Jew during Passover. He violated the prohibition on owning chametz during Passover. So now this chametz becomes prohibited after Passover, no matter to all Jews, no matter who's eating it, whether one who owned it or somebody else. So if it becomes mixed with permitted food after Passover, whether its own kind, some kind of grain product, or a different kind of food like the potato soup, it's going to be permitted, meaning it's permitted as long as it's less than 1/60th or doesn't impart its flavor onto the mixture. And again, this is consistent with Rav and Shmuel's general position about prohibited foods, that if they're mixed with their own kind, prohibited, mixed with a different kind of food, permitted, as long as it doesn't impart its flavor, less than 1/60th of the whole. But Shmuel, during Passover, does not decree that mixed with a different kind of food is going to be prohibited just because somebody might come to mix with its own kind of food during Passover. And the third approach to this question, and now I'm almost done, so if you've got questions or comments, please get them in the comments now, and I will come to your questions. The third approach to this question of prohibited chametz mixed with a permitted food is from Rabbi Yochanan, right? So Rav and Shmuel are Tanaim, right? So they're early generation Talmudic scholars, meaning of the Gemara period after the Mishna, and they're teaching and learning in Bavel, in Babylonian, the Persian Empire. Rabbi Yochanan is a Tana, meaning he's an earlier generation rabbi, the Mishnaic period, who is learning and teaching in the Holy Land. So Rabbi Yochanan says, if chametz, prohibited chametz, falls into a permitted mixture, into permitted food, then this mixture, is what happens with it? If it happens during Passover, whether its own kind or another kind of food, he's going to permit it as long as the prohibited chametz is less than 1/60th of the whole and does not impart its flavor onto the mixture. And after Passover, it's going to be permitted, period. Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, this chametz that was prohibited during Passover is not prohibited after Passover. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he's not even concerned that it was owned by a Jew during Passover. He disagrees with our Mishnah, right? So the law is not, according to Rabbi Yochanan, with respect to chametz after Passover that was owned during Passover by a Jew. He's saying that actually it was permitted for benefit during Passover. He holds, like Rabbi Yosef HaGalili on that, and that's why. So after Passover, when chametz is generally permitted, even the fact that this particular chametz was owned by a Jew during Passover is not going to trouble Rabbi Yochanan. And so this kind of chametz, even if it falls, gets mixed with just regular chametz after Passover, is still going to be permitted according to Rabbi Yochanan. And this accords with Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish's general understanding of what happens when prohibited foods are mixed with permitted foods, because according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, it doesn't matter whether it mixes with its own kind or with a different kind of food, as long as it's less than 1/60th of the whole and doesn't impart its flavor, it is going to be permitted. Now, that is the halacha, generally speaking, when a prohibited food falls into a permitted food, as long as it's less than 1/60th of the mixture, the prohibited food is less than 1/60th of the mixture, it's going to be nullified and the whole is going to remain permitted. However, that is not the law with respect to chametz. Chametz has a very stringent prohibition on it. And so the law is that chametz, leavened products during Passover, render anything that they get mixed with, whether it's of its own kind, some kind of grain product, or not of its kind, so let's say the potato soup, if any chametz falls into that during Passover, the mixture is going to be prohibited. That is the law, and so says Rava, and that accords with our first approach to this question, at least with the mixture that happens during Passover, and the first approach was from Rav. So Rava says that the law accords with Rav's view of what happens when chametz, prohibited leaven, gets mixed with any food during the festival of Passover. Okay, that's what we've got today. We got through our material somewhat efficiently. Let's see if we have some questions here. Neil asks, how can Shmuel or Yochanan ever allow chametz to ever be permitted during Pesach? It's a good question. Like, how could they come out like that? I mean, they're saying that, first of all, in the question that we're talking about, remember, it's nullified. It's just a very small amount of chametz getting mixed with some other food. And they're willing to, for Yochanan is willing to be lenient because just on the nullification principle. Shimon is willing to be lenient, or Shmuel, who's relying on Rabbi Shimon, is willing to be lenient because they're holding that chametz, which is absolutely prohibited during Passover, still, or maybe it's according to Rabbi Yosef Glili, that actually benefit of that is permitted to a Jew even during Passover. That's very controversial ruling there. And your question is good because, generally speaking, they're wrong, right? The halacha does not accord with either Shmuel or Yochanan. They had some reasons for their rulings, but ultimately the law did not come out with them. They get into flavor and fraction, says Neil, but isn't chametz always forbidden during Pesach, as says Rav and the Torah? Yes, you're right. It's sort of hard to understand how they come out, but so we learned that they did come out, and yet, the other sages overruled them. Carolyn says, if patience equals humility equals the opposite of pride, so your question is, we were talking about a little bit yesterday, what is the spiritual, the kind of inner meaning of chametz, which is puffy bread, right? And we associated that with arrogance, and that arrogance sort of precludes submitting to God and gets in the way, actually, of our service to Hashem. So Carolyn says, if patience equals humility, equals the opposite of pride, how can one practice patience and non-leavenness during Passover or otherwise? Okay, so, what a great question. So what you're really asking me is what... if we recognize that being arrogant gets in the way of our service to God, so how can we, as a practical matter, and particularly during Passover, make sure that we remove that chametz, that spiritual chametz, not just because we, at the beginning of Passover, said, hey, we're getting rid of our chametz, and we're getting rid of it, and then hope that it happens. How can we actually practically make sure that we're not acting like spiritually chametz stuffed people during Passover? I mean, like, what are the exercises to counter arrogance? I would say that the first one, the number one thing, is listening, right? Arrogance is very much, maybe not always, but I think it's really, it exists in the interpersonal sphere, right? A person who's just alone is not usually deemed arrogant. We become arrogant in the way that we treat other people. So if we start by listening to them carefully and trying to understand what it is that they want and why, what they want seems to contradict what I want, arrogance is usually like, well, people around me want something different than I want, and I'm just going to make sure that my will prevails, like at all costs. That's basically what arrogance is. Let me know if you guys disagree. So if we're going to be humble, we're going to be much more, and not arrogant, we're going to be much more attuned to the needs of others. And Passover is such a time where, already there's such tight laws about our eating, right? So much is different during Passover. The whole kitchen has been, transformed so that there's no chametz in it. We went through that whole spring cleaning. I do think that exercise, you can't just decide during Passover. You have to prepare to be a humble person, right? And so when you clean out the chametz from your house, meaning when you do that spring cleaning, and then do that final search on the night of the 14th of Nisan, and you go in each room and really, quiz yourself. How was I arrogant in this room in my house? And then, resolve not to be like that during Passover. I think it's just going to be a different question for each person, how we practically, put that to work during Passover, that we're going to remove our spiritual chametz. But if you ask the question, how do I do this? You're halfway to the answer. We actually just had that. Imagine the chutzpah of Joseph in last week's Torah portion, who had been languishing in prison, suddenly called before arguably the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh. And he's called there to interpret a dream. And he's called because he successfully interpreted the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker when they were in prison with him, correctly saying that one of them is going to be restored to his position, the other one's going to be executed. And so the one who was restored, I think the cupbearer, when Pharaoh has a dream that no one can interpret, says, I recall my sins today. I was in prison and there was a Jew there who was able to interpret dreams. So Joseph gets summoned before Pharaoh, and he doesn't just interpret Pharaoh's dream. He takes that extra step and says, and therefore, because there's 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine coming, you should appoint somebody who's going to gather food during the famine, during the years of plenty, to prepare the land for the years of famine. And then Pharaoh says, well, since you know this, no one is as wise as you. You'll be that guy. But what a chutzpah of Yosef to not only tell Pharaoh what his dream means, but what he should do about it. And the answer is, it's not a chutzpah, because somebody who approaches everything that happens in the world as divinely ordained, even when it looks awful and tragic, but just says, okay, there's a purpose for everything, then understands that everything that's happening in our lives is God speaking to us in the language of events. And when God speaks to us, he doesn't give, he gives us a load, right? He loads the camel according to its ability to bear the burden, right? So when he gives us challenges, he's giving us challenges that he knows that we're able to handle in some way. So whenever we're faced with a problem, with an insurmountable problem, even the problem of how am I going to change my behavior, which is really one of the hardest things in the world to do, know that because you're asking that question, it's given to you. There's a solution in what you're analyzing, right? When you're analyzing your own behavior, the fact that you know you need to do better, there you also have the power to do better. It's just going to take organization, right? And commitment, and not just well, I'm going to do better. That's not going to lead to anything. But an organized plan based on what you're seeing in your behavior, that is available and possible. Okay, so let me see this. Okay, so we have a question that came through our inbox. This is from a non-Jewish viewer who says, "Hi, Sal and Nina. As a non-Jew, I understand that the Torah is given within the context of God's covenant with Israel. Certain observances, such as Shabbat and circumcision, are signs of the covenant between God and the Jewish people throughout the generations. However, I learned from your class that a Jew should not get a non-Jew to do activities that the Jew is prohibited to do on Shabbat." Exactly, right? Because when you ask somebody to do something for you, then you're basically appointing them to be your agent, and then you are the cause of this activity that's going to be performed. And if you're prohibited to do it, then appointing an agent to do it for you is still you're causing it to happen, and that's why it's not permitted. But what we can do is say to our non-Jewish friend, we're just sitting in the dark. It's not great. We're sitting in the dark. And then the non-Jew says, "Oh, well, maybe I could turn the light on for you." And you could say, "Oh, really? That'd be great." And then, why is that different? It seems like it's not really different, but it is different, right? Because the non-Jew who's helping you now, they're doing it on their own initiative, and they're doing it because you have a good relationship, and he wants to, do you a favor. And we always get a benefit to ourselves when we give a gift or do a favor to others. He's not acting, the non-Jew in that case is not acting as our agent. They're doing it as something they want to, give a gift of goodwill. So let me continue the question. So based on the above, I come to the impression that although Shabbat is only obligated to the Jew should not get the non-Jew to do something the Jew is prohibited from doing. Perhaps this rule would apply to other observances as well. As such, I was surprised to learn in our journey through Tractate Pesachim that a Jew may sell chametz, leavened products, to a non-Jew, as chametz is prohibited to the Jew during Pesach. That's why you don't give it to a non-Jew, right? You don't say to a non-Jew, "Can you store my chametz for me at your house?" Or, "Can you become the manager of my chametz, that will keep stored at my house, but you're responsible for it?" Because then the non-Jew would be acting as your agent. But if before now you can't sell your chametz to a non-Jew during Passover. Then it's already too late. But before Passover begins, you can sell your food to anyone you want. The chametz hasn't become prohibited yet. So it is entirely permissible to sell your chametz before the time of the chametz's prohibition starts. You can sell it to a non-Jew. You haven't done anything wrong. And then the non-Jew simply owns that chametz. It is not in your possession. In a sense, he's doing you a favor by entering into this symbolic transaction, but the nature of the transaction is it's a transaction, not an agency, and that's why it is permitted. Wait a minute. Nina says I'm going on tangents. Get to the question. Okay, my question. Can I refuse when a Jewish neighbor or acquaintance asks me to buy his or her boxes of cereals because Pesach is around the corner? My intent is not to cause inconvenience to my Jewish neighbor or acquaintance. I'm just trying to uphold God's law. And so the answer, now if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. That's fine. There's nothing is forcing you to do it. But you're definitely not doing anything wrong. This is an absolutely accepted practice. For example, Rabbi Reuben here at the shul on the corner near my house, who is as Haredi as it gets. He's a Hasidic rabbi with the long beard and the fur hat, the shtreimel. And he, enters into a contract with a non-Jew where anyone who wants to can participate when Rabbi Reuben sells the chametz of his congregants to a non-Jew. This is an entirely permitted transaction. Remember that it is not happening during Passover. It benefits us during Passover, but the transaction is entirely happening before Passover happens, and that's why this is permitted. It is permitted, and you do nothing wrong when you participate in that. And finally, you make another point that in one of your podcasts, someone asked whether a Noahide can celebrate Hanukkah. It seems from your reply that you did not answer the question. However, I infer from your reply that Hanukkah is a Jewish national celebration and is not applicable to non-Jews. No offense, but I need to remind that your class is attended by Jews and non-Jews. I understand that you and Nina are reaching out to non-observant Jews. However, when we say we, a non-Jew may think that a certain teaching or lesson may apply to them as well. Perhaps you can clarify to your non-Jewish audience that Hanukkah is meant to be a Jewish national celebration. We can accept that. Once again, thank you for all that you and Nina are doing. Apologize if this email offends. Doesn't offend at all. Thank you very much for asking this question. I always do try to make those distinctions clear when a law or an observance applies to Jews and not to non-Jews. If I was sloppy and didn't make that clear, my apologies to everybody. But yeah, I mean, Hanukkah, our non-Jewish friends can come over and, enjoy that evening with us and eat the latkes, etc. But the obligation to light candles on Hanukkah, something that, and we say a blessing, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to light the festival lights. Interesting, obviously Hanukkah is not in the Torah, it's a later holiday, but yet we say that blessing that he commands us to light those lights because our sages made that decree under the Torah law that in a generation the sages can make such a decree. So yes, so Jews are commanded to light Hanukkah lights, non-Jews are not, right? That is definitely a Jewish holiday meant to be celebrated by Jews, and particularly Hanukkah, which is all about not assimilating into the culture around us. That's what Hanukkah was all about. Right? So that is definitely incumbent on Jews. It is not incumbent on non-Jews. Okay, that's what we've got today. It's been great learning with you all. With God's help, we'll be together tomorrow again at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, when we should be reaching page 30 of Tractate Pesachim with God's help. Have a great rest of your Sunday.